我们将请出的演讲嘉宾呢是来自国际并购整合联盟的Mr. Stefan Hofmeyer， 他将为我们介绍跨境并购成功的关键因素。那么接下来我们将有请这位嘉宾。
See here. 早上好. Good morning. Let's see if I run the machine here. Let's see, it's a new one. First off, I wanted to thank you very much for coming to this event. This is a tremendous opportunity to speak in front of all of you. And I also wanted to point out that the previous presenter in the presentation is a great context to start the presentation that I'll be speaking of here shortly. So today we're going to talk about key success factors in cross-border M&A. Let's see if I can do this, however. It's a big switch here. My background. So in 1994, I started my integration consulting journey out of San Francisco, California. And I had the tremendous opportunity to work for a variety of very large organizations and international organizations. And what was really exciting about that opportunity is I got to see how each of these organizations worked internally as I helped them with their integration. And in 2010, I was introduced to China. I had the opportunity to serve and speak in several international delegations here in Beijing and Tianjin, and I really enjoyed that. And I was really inspired by the dramatic growth of China international business. And this is the context with which I want to speak to today in this presentation. Let me tell you my perspective, coming from the San Francisco area, of the history of China capitalism. 1978 to 1990s, I see that as the foundation of modern China capitalistic enterprise. In the early 2000s, there was a significant amount of mergers and acquisitions, primarily in the petrochemical space, in real estate space, and then there also was Lenovo that acquired the PC business of IBM. That was different. Now, you see significantly more changes and an increased growth, in fact, exponential growth. And you see acquisitions of more complex businesses, such as Volvo in Sweden, AMC Theaters by the Wanda Group, and of course, Lenovo and the acquisition of Motorola, and then, of course, Smithfield Farms, which are major acquisitions that people know about in the United States. They know about them quite a bit. So I wanted to give you two different perspectives on M&A that are somewhat different. First, I want to talk about what I would call kind of the historical traditional mergers and acquisitions. Coming from San Francisco, we have a very tight bond with China in general. During the gold rush and in the 1850s, we had a significant amount of immigration from Canton. And so a significant number of Chinese descendants live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our current mayor in San Francisco, Ed Lee, is a descendant of this. And what we've seen lately is a new type of acquisition from programs such as EB5, which allows for more investment, as well as larger programs. And we see a lot of growth and acquisitions in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I say traditional, I talk about different types of acquisitions, such as buildings in San Francisco, very hard assets, not super complex integrations of culture, but buying things. What you'll see here in the slide, I think it's the new building, the mock-up to the right, that is solely Chinese-funded skyscraper. So that's going to change the skyline of my city. So there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of acquisitions, but it's not as complex as some other acquisitions that we'll talk about here in a second. So Silicon Valley is a different being altogether. Instead of buying real property or buying mines or buying something that's tangible that you can just use or stay a hold of, now you're looking at different types of organizations that provide services, very intangible services, and products, such as technology products. And they have a lot of different employees, and things are a lot more complex. And frankly, there hasn't been a lot of movement with Chinese organizations coming into that market because of the complexity, because of the cultural differences. Now, in the future, that is changing. And there's some subtle things that are quite interesting about that. First off, take a look at the Facebook founder, Mark Zuckerberg. He speaks Mandarin. Now, he doesn't speak it very well, much better than I, But the idea is those are the types of cultural aspects that are changing. The last person on here, the girl, the 9-year-old girl, that's my daughter. And she's 9 years old, and she's had 4 years of immersion Mandarin because her friends speak Mandarin. That's the type of cultural change you're seeing in the San Francisco area. And that will allow, at these very small levels, a significant change in how we do business together. Now, additionally to that, and what you'll see on the bottom, are Chinese companies that are also making a difference. Tencent, for instance, in WeChat. I have been a user of social media tools for some time. Facebook that we have, LinkedIn, I was one of the early adopters of that. In WeChat, I was an early adopter of WeChat. And although I know that that is not a business tool, it is extremely important for my business. And I know that they recently announced that they have 200 million accounts with credit cards associated with it. That's amazing, but that is nowhere near the fundamental change that that tool will provide as we do cross-border business. And here is why. When I wake up every morning in San Francisco at 3 a.m. in the morning, I check my WeChat. I check to see what's going on, what my friends are doing, how my contacts are doing, what they're doing, building new relationships. And so that is a fundamental difference of how we can take new relationships and build that towards things like M&A, which when there's significant cultural differences, we can bridge those gaps. And so moving on, you look at Alibaba and you look at Lenovo. Two very different companies. Alibaba, although they're not super active in Silicon Valley, they are strongly established and they're seen as a peer to any other business in Silicon Valley. And what that does is that not only helps them out, that helps every other Chinese business that's out there to do well and be seen as a global organization. Lenovo is another great example with their acquisition of the PC business from IBM and the recent acquisition of Motorola. That has helped them be established as a global leader. Not a Chinese company, but a global leader in their field. And so these are the things that are changing. And I'll talk about a little later on about how that impacts every business that's looking to do international acquisitions. So there's one point about Silicon Valley that I find is somewhat of a misunderstanding when I go around the world and I meet leaders and such. And that is, people want to somehow replicate that. And in the past, in the 1980s and 1990s, when they talked about Silicon Valley, it was about replicating the location. This is the next Silicon Valley. And what I would say is that it's something different. There's something greater. It's about where things happen. That is the concept. So geography is less important now. If you think about location, you're thinking somewhat backwards. Right now, it's about the company's reputation and the company being the place to work. When a larger company or any company acquires another company, those people in that company, are they excited to be acquired? Are they excited to work for that new organization? Those are the things that are going to make a difference as we move forward. All right, so let's talk about acquisition considerations specifically. All right, so when you look at acquisition considerations, let's look at overall strategy. Like the previous speaker had mentioned, we must establish an acquisition strategy. That's extremely important. What you'll find out in the market is some companies just buy companies because they're a bargain. And so it's important to establish that acquisition strategy and not only focus on it during the acquisition, but how is that company after acquisition going to be integrated and aligned with the overall business? And it's an extremely important piece of it. Now let's talk about several areas that are also quite interesting related to that and why companies buy other companies. In a lot of situations, people think, in fact, my personal experience, I get calls where people say, I'm looking for an organization, do you know anybody that's a good deal, a good bargain? And the reality is they're not out there. The reality is it's a marketplace that's fairly open and people know exactly what they're looking to acquire and what they're looking to sell. But the key component of that, and Andrew Scola, who will be here later, will talk about it, is the synergies related to an acquisition. How you acquire something and it's more valuable than what you acquired based on how the two companies work together and combine. And so when you look at an organization that is being acquired, to you, because maybe they provide a new sales channel or a new supply chain or new technology, to you, they may be worth $500 million. To your competitor, that value may be less. It may be $250 million. So instead of looking at the basic value of the company, look at how that company adds value to you holistically. And next, look at brands. Now we've talked about brands. Brands can go two different ways. The negative way is to buy a brand, maybe it's a poor performing brand that everybody knows. And maybe for that brand, it's more of a pride of ownership, but it's losing money. And after you acquire that brand, guess what? You've acquired the brand and it's still losing money and you're still having to pay for it. That's a negative reason to use a brand. However, as mentioned earlier, with Lenovo, use companies to establish your overall global brand. That's net additive above what the company that you're buying and above the value that it is. So those are things to consider as you look for an integration strategy. And to ensure, as mentioned, to establish that strategy and follow through with that through the integration. Another aspect I want to talk about is the benefits of a global brand. As a global brand, there are faster deal approvals, improved intention and contribution, as I mentioned earlier, improved corporate performance, and a better foundation for serial acquisitions. And as a global brand, you don't have to be a multinational in many countries with many different employees. You can be a state-owned enterprise that is a global brand. It's the way you think, and it's the way you work. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In fact, go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about what a global brand means. There are very different components to a global brand. First, which is culture. Christoph will be speaking about later today, and about how culture impacts your company to be seen as a global brand versus a foreign brand. There's organization, how transparent and clear your organization is, and how that's set up to be a global brand. There's governance, clear, methodical, established governance that makes a significant difference. We'll talk about that next. Employee diversity. So when a company from China, say, acquires a company in Silicon Valley or Germany, not only are you bringing employees from the acquiree, the company doing the investment, but you're combining the diversity of the employees to have local employees, local consultants, and other original personnel all together. And then finally, reputation, to, of course, establish a positive global brand. And of course, that's relatively self-explanatory. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about integration governance. What we at Global PMI Partners have, and what we do in our training, is establish a framework from going to simply buy a company to actually making it run and establish the synergies that make the company much more successful. And what we see here in blue is where we establish before an acquisition occurs, pre-close, pre-deal, where we plan out, and up to 120 days before pre-deal, we plan out the structure the integration takes prior to close and prior to owning the company. The green areas identify what happens after close, after you own the organization, and what that means to your organization, how you execute. So let's talk briefly about each one of those. What you'll see here is the need to understand the integration approach. What are you going after? And there's some fundamental principles to consider. First is to understand the difference between the deal team and an integration team. A deal team may be outside consultants. They may also be internal executives. They're tasked with identifying targets to acquire, to completing due diligence, and to negotiating to close a deal. The integration team, outside of that, they're in charge of doing some of the tough, kind of dirty work to put the company together afterwards. And so it's important to know the difference and not assume the deal team will be the team that follows on through with the integration. And as far as the integration team goes, it's important, as mentioned earlier, up front, up to 120 days before close, is to establish the integration strategy and planning so you know what you're doing after you acquire an organization. And also to make sure that the deal team hands off to the integration team. I cannot tell you how many times a deal will close, the integration team gets all excited, or the deal team gets all excited, they throw a party, and then they leave because their work is done. But the reality is there needs to be a sync up from the business drivers of the original deal to what gets implemented. And the integration team needs to take that forward and connect through formal meetings and a formal handoff. Next, as we look at integration, we not only need to have that handoff and look at a high level, but we also need to go down, what we call work streams, and look at the different business functions of an event. Sales, marketing, operations, things of that nature. And understand that we need to have that in order. We need to look at business continuity. Because the reality is, when a company gets acquired, the sales team says, I'm not going to sell so much. I'm going to wait to see what happens. And then we need to look at local resources. What are they going to do? Are they going to be happy, or are they all going to leave immediately? It's kind of a big deal when you look at some of these softer types of acquisitions when you're not acquiring hard assets. All right, so when you look at this, when you look at the integration approach, the idea is you need to have the structure and methods to complete the tasks. And one thing that you'll find is, let's say there's a really good, brilliant person here that goes through heroics to make things successful. What you'll find is that if they're successful here, it doesn't necessarily mean that person will be successful in a cross-border acquisition. You need to rely on the individuals on the ground. They may be people you've acquired. They may be external consultants to handle the acquisition tasks. So that's extremely important to consider. The next item to consider is the communication aspect and the employee feedback. Unlike a variety of different things where you're on the ground and you see these things happen every day and make decisions on it, with an acquisition, you need to have an understanding. You need to foster the feedback from the individuals that have been acquired and others to make sure that they tell you the truth as to what's going on. So as an executive, you can make decisions related to that and make a difference. And of course, with that, you must also manage by metrics. In a lot of situations, and I've dealt in cultures where you have individuals and they manage by saying everything's going great, everything is what's called green, the stoplight approach. Perfect. But the reality is you really don't know how well things are going. And if you take that approach where it's vague, oftentimes you'll find out way too late that things are going not so well. So it's important to manage by metrics. Identify what tasks are complete. Look at the financials. How are the numbers coming in? What makes a difference? Those are the things to take a look at. And then finally, is to move quickly and keep a focus. Now, there's two aspects that I've seen in a lot of acquisitions, and here's a common one. An acquisition occurs, and they're late in planning. They're planning on how to integrate the two companies. And so what happens is the people freeze. They don't think about their day job anymore. They're thinking about, am I going to have a job? They're thinking about, what's this new structure? Where am I going to be? Maybe I should, instead of spending half my time doing sales, maybe I should spend half my time looking for another job. And so it's important to state quickly what's going to happen. Retain the folks with packages as you need to make sure that they know that they're going to be around, and let other people know where they fit as well. The second aspect of that, and I had this recently in an acquisition in an international area, where there's a highly aggressive culture locally. And what they did, and my client was a very, very slow-moving, methodical client that wanted to do everything right. They wanted to know 100% before they moved on. And what happened in that situation is they started planning. Oops, I apologize. Back up again. But they had the challenge where they didn't communicate and they didn't have the plan out quickly. And the local organization that was being acquired decided, they're going to run the show themselves. They know what's right, and they just moved ahead with what they thought the changes were. In that situation, the company being acquired was just moving on, and now there was this rollback change effect that needed to occur in order to get them back on track. So the point here, and the point overall, is to plan early, plan holistically, not just of the acquisition, but what do you do with the organization after you acquire it, and make sure you move quickly and expediently, and sometimes on knowing 80% of the information you have, because you can't wait around for the 100% the entire time. So that's what, to me, M&A integration is. That's, I believe, the difference in cross-border M&A and dealing with softer types of acquisitions. That will become more the norm as our cultures get closer together and as we develop. What you'll see here is how do we work in a more detailed environment where not only we're talking at the high executive level, but sales, marketing, finance, and operations, how do they work together? What we need to do, typically, in a complex integration is we have several people leading these different business functions, such as sales. What we have is the acquiring company lead that will be leading the function. You'll have a target representative as well, so they can represent what's currently ongoing. And in some cases, you'll bring in a third-party local consultant to help out as well with each of those work streams. And they all report up to what we call an integration management office, which is typically a generally accepted best practice, that then establish how companies work together. And then we have a steering committee, which is the executive team. And so that's the organization that we need to put in place to make things work. And overall, if you establish this formality and you establish the structure and you establish it holistically, then not only does it work well for the initial acquisition, but it's something that you can repeat with serial acquisitions as you move forward. What does our business future look like? I argue that it'll be blended cultures with cultural understanding. There'll be a common language through technology, such as WeChat, where I just hit translate, and boom, there I have the translated version of my friend that only speaks Mandarin, through technology and multilingualism, like Mark Zuckerberg and my daughter. And also pervasive, integrated, and standardized business practices. Not Western business practices, not Chinese business practice, but standardized business practices. And I would argue, what's interesting about this is this is now. This is not really in the future. This is actually now. The difference is that this work needs to just roll out. And if we all think this way, and if we all take this into consideration in the future, we'll have great success together. Thank you very much for your time.